Okay, everyone. So, welcome to the third of these six sections of the of the 12th module, the wisdom of emptiness, is part of the Discovering Buddhism series, and I think it would be a good idea to follow a pattern that we've established before, and that is to just spend a few minutes calming and collecting the mind. Now, the instructions for this have been given several times, but just as a brief reminder, first we sit in an upright, comfortable posture, and during that period of time, the main thing to do is really relax. We shouldn't approach meditation as if it's some kind of difficult chore where we're very tense. But just to find a posture in which we feel well connected with the earth, well grounded, and upright, alert, and yet without leaving a state of calm relaxation. And then, since we have brought with us from the earlier events of this day many different types of energy, some of which are confused, some of which are frustrated, then it's quite helpful to begin by taking a series of 3 cleansing breaths. So as we sit in a well-grounded, upright posture, raising our sternum slightly and softening our belly. Then we take 3 long, deep, complete in-breaths, filling our abdomen completely, and only after that, raising our diaphragm and filling our chest. And then, and this is perhaps the most important part, as we exhale, feel that we're letting go completely. Not simply letting go of the air, but letting go of any tension, any confusion, any difficulties, any tendency of the mind to scatter, and so forth. And then at the completion of those 3 full, complete cleansing breaths, simply allow the breath to return to normal, watching it as it comes and goes of its own will. So we can do that now. Letting go completely with each exhalation. So the first phase of this introductory meditation is relaxation. And so now that we've achieved some measure of relaxation, we move to the second phase, which is to cultivate a continuity of attention. And we'll choose for this the incoming and the outgoing breath. So we take our attention and we can focus it either on the rise and the fall of the abdomen as we inhale and exhale, or upon the sensations at the gateway of our nostrils as the air passes in and out. I suggest for this evening we start with the rise and the fall of the abdomen. So at this point, we're no longer controlling our breath as we did in the 3 cleansing breaths that we took earlier. We're simply letting the breath come and go as it will, whether it be deep or shallow, rapid or slow, without exerting any conscious control over it. We may use as our model a sleeping baby, completely unconscious and yet breathing naturally, rhythmically, completely. But here, unlike the sleeping baby, we are fully conscious. And we use that conscious attention to remain aware of the rise and the fall of the abdomen. And we'll do that for a few moments. During this phase, let us try to cultivate a continuity of attention. We're aware of the rise and the fall, the next rise, the next fall, and so on, without a break in between, so that the rise and the fall of the abdomen becomes the sole object of this focused attention. If our attention becomes distracted in any way, then let go of that distraction. Again, we can use the out-breath. So any thought other than the rise and the fall of the abdomen, we simply let go of as we breathe out and return to becoming aware of the breath. And now we can shift into the third and last phase of this introductory part of the meditation, and that is to cultivate a vividness of attention. There has been a relaxation of our body and mind. There has been some measure of continuity. We're maintaining an awareness from breath to breath. Now we want to enhance the quality of vividness to this awareness. And here it may be helpful to shift the focus of our attention from the rise and fall of the abdomen to the very subtle sensations that are created as the air that we're breathing in and breathing out passes through the gateway of our nostrils. These are such subtle sensations that we might find it difficult at first to locate them. If that's the case, you can use the fingers of one hand just simply to touch the area between the nostrils and the upper lip. Touch it with your fingers, just to sense the physical sensations that are created there. And then, using that to anchor and focus your attention, be like a sentry who stands in front of the entrance to a castle and notes the people as they pass on their way in and pass on their way out. But here, we are noting the breath as it passes in through the gateway of the nostrils and out. Again, to the extent that we are able, simply allow the breath to come and go as it will. Our job is not to control it. Our job is simply to observe it, staying in the present moment. And try to become aware of each breath from its very beginning to its very end. At the beginning, the air moves in through the nostrils very subtly, then picks up some strength or some speed, and then finally, some seconds later, comes to an end. And the same as the breath leaves the nostrils. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Try to become vividly aware of each inhalation and each exhalation from its very subtlest beginning to its very subtlest end, one after the next. As we are focusing our attention, the main portion of our attention, on the incoming and outgoing breath, we retain a certain corner of the mind, a spy-like corner of the mind, just to check to see how the meditation is going. And if we discover that our attention has drifted away from the incoming and outgoing breath, which is the stated object of this phase of the meditation, then the moment we discover that, the moment we discover that we have become occupied with a thought, an emotion, a memory of the past, an anticipation of the future, or any other bodily sensation whatsoever, the moment we discover that, then we simply let go of that extraneous object and gently but firmly place our attention back once again on the incoming and the outgoing breath. And now, for the concluding phase of this meditation, having cultivated a sense of relaxation, a continuity of attention, and a certain vividness, now we are going to take those three qualities and apply it to an object other than the rise and fall of the abdomen or the incoming and outgoing breath. But we'll try to apply these same qualities of relaxed, continuous, and vivid attention to this new object that we practiced with the breath. And this object is simply ourself, our sense of being here, the sense of I, of me. One helpful way of going about that is to just go back in time and go over the events that led us to this room at this time. So you might recount certain events of the day. I woke up at such a time, I had breakfast, I went to work, I met with my friends, I had this nice conversation, I had this bad argument, this happened to me, that happened to me. I went through the day. I had various events take place. I listened to this. I saw that. I felt this way. I felt that way. And then eventually, as the time grew near, I got in the car. I drove through traffic. I made my way up the hill. I parked the car. I came into this building. I met some old friends. I spoke about this. I spoke about that. I sat down. I watched all the preliminaries take place in front of me. I listened to the instructions. And now, right now, at this very moment, I am sitting here. Who is sitting here? I am. We think about I all day long. So what is the I doing now? And be very present. Be very honest. Certainly, we can say, I am sitting here. We can also say, I am meditating. Or, I am trying to meditate. Or, I'm trying to understand the instructions. Or, I feel frustrated with this meditation. Or, I feel calm sitting here. Or, I feel agitated sitting here. I just heard that bird make a sound. Now I feel an itch in my shoulder. I forgot the instructions. Oh yes, I am supposed to be aware of what I am doing now. I'm sitting here. I'm meditating. In this or any other similar way that is an accurate description of what's going on right now, cultivate the strong sense of I. Don't worry or censor oneself as to how this I might be appearing. If the thought arises, I wish this meditation were finished already. I'm getting tired. That is also an entrance into the sense of I. The I that wishes the meditation was over. The I that is getting tired. I am sitting here. Now you'll remember that when the breath was the object of our meditation, we allowed the main portion of our attention to be on the breath itself, and a corner of our mind to investigate, how is the meditation going? Am I still on the object, or has my attention drifted away? And then if we notice our attention has drifted away, we bring it back gently but firmly to the breath. Here we are going to do something somewhat similar. The main portion, the main focus of our attention is on this sense of I. I am sitting here. I am meditating. I am bored. I wish it were over. I like this. I don't like this. Whatever it may be, that strong sense of I being here, the sense of self. The major portion of our attention is focused on this sense of self, this sense of I. But with the corner of our mind, with this spy-like attention, we do some investigation. We can ask ourselves, while holding on to this feeling of I, of self, this corner of our mind can ask ourselves, where is the I? Where exactly in the body is the I? The I who's sitting here meditating. It may happen that when we ask that question, the I that we've been holding on to up to that point fades. If that's the case, then recreate that sense of self simply by reminding ourselves, I'm sitting here meditating, or by going into the past, cultivating a memory of what I did earlier today, and bring us into the present moment until we have the feeling of the I sitting here and meditating. And once it's back, continue the investigation. Where is this I? Where is it to be found? And if we can't find it in the body, then let's look for it in the mind. Which one of the innumerable thoughts and feelings and emotions that pass through our mind, which one of these, if any, is the I that's sitting here meditating? And now we can bring this meditation to a final close by generating the strong motivation for the remainder of this session that by investigating the nature of the I, we can come to a clearer understanding of the difference between what exists and what doesn't exist. And in this way, increase the wisdom that banishes the ignorance that lies at the root of all suffering. And having extracted this root cause of suffering from our own mind, then we dedicate ourselves to bringing happiness, peace, well-being, and fulfillment to all other beings, especially those who lack the wisdom eye and therefore are unable to distinguish between the way things actually exist and their fantasy projections about them. So, now the homework assignment from last week was several times during the day and then during the week that passed to just try to become aware of the sense of I, the sense of self, the sense of me, as it arises. Were you able to do that? Yeah? Were you able to surprise yourself to suddenly say, oh, there's I, there's me? What kind of experience did you have when you looked at the I, or the sense of self, or the sense of me, when you kind of discovered it arising? What kind of effect did it have to become aware of it that way? Anything? Yes?
I was just aware of how often the I shows up.
How often, yeah.
You know, it's depending on where I'm at, working or with my family, and how it can go from body to mind to, you know, all within like a few seconds.
Yes.
You know, conversation or, you know?
Yeah.
Like I'm feeling sick. Oh, I'm not going to go do that today, or I'm, you know, and it just kind of flows out. Just, you know, it was interesting to see.
Did anyone else have that kind of experience of the rapidity? Well, first, as I mentioned, just how often it comes up. You don't have to wait a long time before thinking I.
That's not the hard part.
Right. And then how it seems to relate to so many different activities. It's not the same thing over and over again. Often very, very different even from moment to moment. Some of you have heard teachings on the 6 realms of existence. You know, the higher realms of the gods, the anti-gods and the humans, and the lower, more suffering realms of the animals and pretas and hell beings. And raise your hand if you've heard teachings that touch on that. Okay, so some of you are aware of that. And the teachings are often described as these are states of rebirth that we can find ourselves in. You know, depending on the karma we create, we could actually end up spending a lifetime or two in any of these realms. And that's evidently true. But even here, immediately in our experience, when we chart where the I crops up, the I seems to be moving from realm to realm, as if it was dying from one realm and being reborn into another every moment of the day. So when we're thinking, oh, it's really hot in here, I feel really uncomfortable, this is so boring, then it's like we're in this kind of never-ending hell realm, right? And then the breeze blows and we think, that was nice, I really feel refreshed by that. Then suddenly we're in the God realm. I haven't eaten in a while, I'm hungry again. You get a feeling in our stomach, we think, I'm hungry. So then we're in the Preta realm. We just can't wait to devour something. Any time between now and when food enters our mouth is like an eternity. So we're in the Preta realm. And then when we feel kind of dumb and kind of stupid, it's like we've suddenly become some kind of brute animal who can only, can't see very much past the tip of its nose, doesn't remember very much of the past, can't really think very much about the future, but just is running on, brute instinct. And so on and so forth. It's as if the potential for all of those realms of existence are within us, and none of them are static. Even when we do a lot of preparation to have a lovely experience, we buy the tickets to the most exotic destination, we make sure we're traveling with the nicest, most attractive companions, we're staying at the most comfortable hotel, eating the most delicious food. Even though when we put a lot of effort into arranging the circumstances of a God realm, for example, right? That doesn't mean that our experience there is going to be a God realm experience. Could be a hell realm experience, I called room service and they took 10 minutes to answer. So we spent 10 minutes in this kind of state of recrimination and anger, like that. Okay. So that's one thing that shows up. The continuous arousal of the sense of self, and yet how many different contexts it arises in. Okay. Anything else? Thank you. That was very, very helpful. Anything else? Yes, please.
Yes, it helped me when I was real emotional or attached to something, even not super emotional, but just the attachment, even whether it's good or bad, to kind of level out a little and feel more relaxed. And sometimes if I was really suffering, it just kind of brought it down a few notches for a moment, but sometimes it seemed like it just solved the problem, even though I didn't stay really aware of the I.
Okay. Now, what exactly calmed it down or solved the problem? What about the process helped?
The idea that it wasn't real, that the perspective that I was taking wasn't an accurate perspective, I think. I don't know for sure. It seemed kind of...
But for instance, when you were in any of those states, whether you were feeling happy or sad or frustrated or calm, at that moment you did feel that. I mean, that's why you could say, I feel this or I felt that.
But there was a layer of assumptions on top of that feeling about what that feeling meant. Like it's going to last so many hours or days, or I'm a failure, or life is perfect, and then, crash and burn. Leveled that out.
This is very, very helpful. When we start in seeing how the I arises, sometimes it's kind of what we might call bedrock reality. Like we touch something hot and it burns and we pull our finger away and we say, oh, I hurt. It seems to be relating to something, that we can point to and say, oh, there's a reason I felt that way. That fire burns, something like that. Other times, the I gets involved in the only technical term I can think of is mishigas, which isn't exactly Sanskrit. But just ridiculous confusion. Just not at all relating to bedrock reality, but assumption upon assumption upon assumption. And at the moment, it feels very real. I'm upset. But then when we ask ourselves, well, just a second ago I was happy, and probably a few seconds from now I'll be calm again. So why exactly am I upset now? Then we start investigating that, and then we realize it's a shadow, a chimera. Nothing solid, but just an idea. And an idea which is often groundless. or very nearly so. Okay? So that's also something that comes along with this investigation, is a sense that, yes, the I arises in relationship to these experiences, but the experiences themselves are fleeting. They're not permanent. They're changing every moment. In fact, the more accurately I look at them, then they seem to be changing every second, every nanosecond, every fraction of a nanosecond. And so the substrata of a solid, unchanging reality is not there. And without it, that sense of the experiences being most real and most vital to my happiness, of that sense of urgency, which is actually a sense of tension, relaxes. Okay? Did anyone get kind of a little bit of a flavor of that during the investigation this last week? Okay. Sometimes even just a whiff of it is quite liberating. It's like we don't, yes, at the moment I feel sad or nervous or upset or frustrated, but I know from experience that I didn't always feel that way, and I won't always feel that way. And just that itself can be very liberating. Okay. Okay. Anything else anybody wants to, feels the urgency to say? Yes, please.
I found myself struggling. I mean, I guess evaluating the performance of this eye as it arose, and at least at times, rather than simply observing, and especially evaluating in terms of sort of the generosity of my actions, or self-serving quality of my actions. And at times it works well to be generous, but then I find myself struggling with this sort of notion of, should I always give up everything about myself, and then does that lead to kind of obliterating myself? And I can't quite feel good about just always giving in everything to everybody, and it sort of seems like, well, I'm not quite sure that's the sort of person I want to be, or should be, or whether that's even intended here. So kind of grappling with that.
Yeah. That's good grappling. That's very important grappling, because we do have this tendency of approaching our life in general, but especially when we're dealing with deep spiritual matters, many of us have a natural tendency of shoulding ourselves. I should be this way, or I shouldn't be that way. And when we start investigating that, it's as if one thing is going on, but on top of that, there's an overlay of judgment. And often we've removed ourselves from what is actually going on, and we're living in this world of judgment. And just noting that that's a tendency of the mind is helpful. As our understanding not only of ourselves gets broader, but of the teachings themselves, then we can learn to be more balanced. We can learn, for instance, that there are appropriate times to turn our attention towards the welfare of others, let's say, and appropriate times to take care of what's happening here now. It's like it says in Ecclesiastes, there's a time to give and a time to take. And so we don't have to take an unrealistic, judgmental stance, this kind of questioning, constantly judging what's happening, but we can apply more balance to it. But at this point, is simply helpful to notice that that's a tendency of the mind. That's another voice. I am judging myself. When that comes up, that's what's happening. I feel like a failure. I feel like a success. I feel that went well. I feel that went badly, like that. So even just simply noticing that that's what's going on. That we're making those judgments. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Why don't we do a little bit more before we take our break? Midian, I don't think we'll start with this one. We'll start with one of the ones underneath, but I'm not sure which one it is. So we can do it one by one. You can just flip it over the top.
Yeah, I'm just putting
Oh,
it
yeah.
down.
Oh, great. Nope. Not that one. Nope.
That's that one.
Great. Thank you. Okay. This, on this chart, it starts with what's known as the 4 seals. And I think it may become clear in a moment why I have this chart and how it relates to what's gone on before. It is said that there are 4 seals which testify to a particular teaching or a particular doctrine being the word of the Buddha. In other words, if you find in any teaching, in any doctrine, if you find these 4 attributes present, then that's like a seal or a stamp. This is the teaching of the Buddha. Okay? That's why they're called the 4 seals. Here the image is of, let's say a proclamation or an order comes from the king, and it's to be carried out by the army. Well, the head of the army wants to make sure that this order really comes from the king. He doesn't want to go off invading some other country without it being the king's command. So on the proclamation, on the order, there has to be a seal, like a wax seal stamped with the stamp of the king. When the general looks at that, says, this is genuine, this is not counterfeit, this actually comes from the king, then he does his best to carry out the orders. So in a similar fashion, when we listen to teachings of any type, and we want to ascertain, does this accord with the intentions of the Buddha? Then we look for these seals, these 4 seals, testifying that this indeed is a genuine teaching of the Buddha. And there are 4. And so, the first one is all products are impermanent. All products are impermanent. It's really difficult to avoid technical language when speaking about these things, but there is an easy way of understanding it as well. Here, the difficult word in that, I think, is product. What's a product? Well, a product is anything produced. Anything that comes together as the result of causes and circumstances. And it's very easy to come up with examples of products because everything we see, everything we hear, everything we smell, everything we taste, and everything we touch are all products. And consequently, they're all impermanent. So, what do I see in front of me? Well, here's a flower. Okay? So, we call it a flower, but what is it? Well, we can look at its history, its causes, its conditions. We can trace it back to a seed. We can think about the nutrition, the sunlight, the water, and so forth. We can see how it grew into its present shape, how it has certain color, and so forth. And all of that indicates that the flower in front of us is a product. It was produced by a coming together of causes and circumstances. Right? It's made up of parts. Whether we think of the parts in a large sense, like petals, leaves, stems, and so forth, or whether we do our investigation on a more microscopic level, the parts being elements, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, and the like. Okay? So what we call flower, in other words, what we see with our eye here, and what we smell with our nose, and what we can touch and taste, but I don't think I want to do that, and there's not much sound it's producing, but it could produce a sound, couldn't it? Right? If the wind were blowing, then the vibration of the flower could produce a sound. So what I'm seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, and whatever the other one was. Hearing, right? Exactly. It's a good reason I forgot that one, because I'm not really hearing anything at the moment, but I could, right? So that object is a product, and being a product, it's impermanent. Means it's changing from moment to moment. And it doesn't need something else to make it change. The very fact that it's a product means, because it's a coming together of different particles, subatomic particles, and so forth, causes and conditions, since it is an amalgam of a coming together of all these different elements, it has its impermanence built into it already. Right? No collection of things ever stays a coherent collection. If there's a coming together, that implies there will be a falling apart. And so its impermanent nature isn't something added onto it from the outside. It's innate into the phenomena itself. If it's a product, it is necessarily impermanent. It doesn't start out being solid and permanent and then becomes impermanent. It's impermanent even when it doesn't appear to be changing. Right? Its deeper nature is impermanent. Okay. How many minutes do we have left? About 4 minutes. Okay. So that seal is a very important seal of Buddha's teachings. When Buddha first started teaching, when he first turned the wheel of Dharma, impermanence was a theme that he spoke about. And then during the remaining 45 years of his life, impermanence was a theme that he returned to again and again. And then in the last recorded teaching that he gave, just before passing away, he said, all compounded phenomena, and compounded again means a product, a coming together of different elements, all compounded phenomena are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. Those are the last recorded words of Buddha as far as I've ever been able to find. So impermanence it was important in the beginning, the middle, and the end of his teachings. And obviously at the very end, he himself was demonstrating passing away. And that for us, of course, is the biggest impermanence, isn't it? There's the impermanence of our smooth skin getting wrinkled. There's the impermanence of our clothes growing older. But the final impermanence is death. Okay? So the reality of impermanence implies also the reality of death. So very, very important key element of the Buddhist teaching is understanding impermanence. And why is that important? Because even though all compounded phenomena, all products are impermanent, the way we relate to them often is to deny that reality, or to be unaware of that reality, and to relate to them as if they were static and unchanging. And so a great deal of emotional upheaval can be let go of just by simply remembering this too will pass. This too is impermanent. Okay? So why don't we give ourselves a break now? Not a terribly long one, but enough to refresh ourselves, and then we'll continue. Last time, an old friend of mine who I had invited to teach in my place, Thupten Pende, he came, and at that time it looked as though he would honor us with his teaching on a following week, such as this evening. But when we got home, we exchanged a few emails, and he said he had the very strong sense that it would probably be best for this explanation to continue coming from one source, since every teacher's style is so different, and since his style is so different from mine, that it might be confusing right in the midst of things to have another presentation, a different presentation. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt he was very right in saying that. I get that feeling even when I read some of the recommended readings that have been passed out. I feel that even though they come from excellent sources, that their different voice and their different style, in many cases, is probably more confusing than helpful to the students here, which is why I've refrained from really strongly recommending that you read anything but certain selected sections. On top of that, some of the teachings were given in broken English and translated from Italian. And some of them contain conversations which are very, very hard to follow. So there's a lot of things in the recommended teachings which could be a distraction. And as Pende said, having another teacher right in the midst could also be a distraction. But having said that, if in the future you have a chance of receiving teachings in the same area by other more qualified teachers, whether it be one of our Tibetan lamas or a senior student like Thupten Pende and so forth, I very much urge you to attend. The more that we can hear these things from different points of view, through different voices, the more our wisdom of hearing, the first wisdom, more that grows. Then on the basis of that, there becomes more food for contemplation. And then on the basis of that, then we can actually meditate and make the conclusions part of our being. But changing horses in midstream was not such a good idea, so we passed it up. So that's why I'm here tonight. Why you're here, I have no idea. Unless the snacks are really good. Okay. So, getting back to these seals, one of the things we have to remember is the whole purpose of Buddha giving any teaching, whether it's his first teaching, his last teaching, or anything in the 45 years in between, the whole purpose for any of those teachings is simply to let people find a way out of unhappiness, out of suffering, and to experience calmness, clarity, peace, happiness, well-being, fulfillment. Okay? And so the Buddha identified certain patterns of mind which are destructive of our happiness and lead to experiences of frustration and unhappiness, and focused his teachings on allowing us to gain a deeper and deeper understanding of what these factors were. And so this mistake of viewing phenomena which are in fact impermanent as if they were permanent, that is one of the basic downfalls that we experience in our life. And we have that experience over and over again, don't we? You know, our head may tell us, you know, that this beautiful, attractive object in front of us is impermanent and will change over time, but the way we react to it, the way we lust after it, you know, the way we develop a strong, insatiable passion for it means that we're disregarding whatever our intellect may tell us, and we're relating to that object as if it were a permanent, unchanging source of happiness. You know, that the car is always going to be new and shiny, that our spouse is always going to be young and attractive, you know, that the job is always going to be interesting, that the clothes are always going to fit, whatever it is, right? And because these are products, and products are impermanent, that's false. It's a mistake. Lama Yeshe used to refer to that as the permanent conception. But he didn't mean by saying that the conception was permanent. He meant it's a conception of permanence that we lay over impermanent phenomena. Okay? Obviously, there's much more that can and has been said about this topic, but I want to move on to the second one, which is actually coming from what we just said, that we view an object as a source, as a permanent, unchanging source of what? Source of happiness. So as if these objects themselves had inherent in them some positive quality, some quality of making us happy. You know, that the new shiny car, the young attractive spouse, the well-paying job, these things were ultimately sources of happiness. That's another misconception. Because the second seal says all contaminated things are miserable. And here miserable doesn't just mean that they're miserable, but it means that they're productive of misery. Productive of misery. Okay? So what that means, all contaminated phenomena, means all the things that come into existence through the interworking of ignorance and the various delusions, such as hatred, attachment, jealousy, arrogance, and the like. And if we want to summarize that, all the elements of samsara. That's not a term that I've really used before, I don't think, in this particular module, but a lot of people have heard it before. This kind of round of life, death, and rebirth based upon ignorance and fraught with suffering and dissatisfaction. That's samsara, also known as cyclic existence. So all contaminated things means everything that partakes of samsara, right, is what? Is miserable. That's pretty heavy. It means that none of these things are capable of producing the long-term sense of happiness, security, well-being, fulfillment that we desire. In fact, if they're productive of anything, they're productive of their opposite. Mm-hmm. Even things that we run to thinking they will give us pleasure, and which do give us pleasure for a few moments, if we are continually exposed to them, that pleasure sooner or later, and often sooner than later, turns into its opposite. There's this one cartoon which I really should blow up and make into a poster of its own, because it teaches so much of the Dharma so well, communicates it so well. It's a color cartoon from the Calvin and Hobbes series. Okay, you know, the boy with his pet tiger, that one. And in it, the two of them, it's a winter's day, and they've just come out from the cold, and they run over to the fire. There's a big fire burning in the fireplace. They run over to the fire, and they're warming themselves in front of the fire, and they've got this incredible beatific smiles on their face. And then as they stay there, the fire is really getting hot, and they're starting to sweat and get uncomfortable. So they run away, and they stand closer to the door, and they feel this great relief. You know, now they're kind of cooling off. but then short after that they start to get a bit cold again, so then they run over to the fire, and then and they're relieved again, and they're so happy, but they stay a little bit too long, and it starts getting hot again, so they run back to the door and they cool off again. And then Calvin says to Hobbes, he says, "If this isn't true happiness, I don't know what is." It's like he was channeling Lama Zopa when he wrote this cartoon, you know. And so much of our experience, when we face up to it honestly, is like that. It gives us, it attracts us as if it was the ultimate good, the ultimate happiness, the toothpaste which is not only going to make our teeth clean and our breath smell sweet, but it's also going to attract, Jennifer Lopez and Brad Pitt and everything to our side, and we'll live happily ever after. It looks that way in the beginning, right? And then quickly turns to something that we can't wait to divorce. So what seems to be a source of happiness, well-being, and so forth, becomes a source of misery because it, in and of itself, is incapable of giving us the happiness, well-being, fulfillment that it seems to promise. So looking at things whose nature is miserable as if its nature was happiness-producing, that's another misconception that we overlay onto reality. And so Buddha pointed that out as well. Okay. Now the implications of these things we have to kind of work out for ourselves over a period of time. Many people, when they hear the Buddha's teachings on this for the first time, think, oh, then, I should, it's all crap, so I just get rid of everything, go live by myself in the middle of the desert or something like that. We can jump to false conclusions. But basically what Buddha is asking us to do is check what our habitual, uninvestigated reaction to things are, and see if it partakes of any of these misconceptions. And then to the extent that they do, try to combat them, remove them, and see what results. Okay? So the first one is the misconception of seeing impermanent phenomena as if they were permanent. The second seal is seeing things which are in the nature of suffering as if they were in the nature of happiness, as if they could give us full, lasting happiness. Then the third ceiling, and this is really now getting very close, right on to the subject matter of this module specifically, the third one is all phenomena are empty or selfless. Now, if we were to be doing a very, very accurate word-by-word investigation of these things in great depth, then in this context, empty and selfless are not exact synonyms. They're referring to slightly different realizations. But for our general purposes here, and it'll serve us quite well, here phenomena being empty and phenomena being selfless are we can use interchangeably. So whenever you hear emptiness, you can substitute selfless. Okay? So here, all phenomena, without exception, are empty, are selfless. And so that pertains to this subject matter, the wisdom of emptiness. But what does it mean exactly to be empty or to be selfless? Okay. I'm going to pass on that for a moment. Okay? But this point is, of all of the seals, this one is the great seal. This third one is the great seal. Because it's the understanding of emptiness or selflessness which in fact eradicates the root causes of our suffering. Understanding impermanence is very important, and it helps. Extremely important. kind of can't overemphasize the importance of understanding impermanence on so many different levels. Correcting our mistaken view that things which are contaminated themselves do not have the ability to give us lasting happiness is also extremely important. But by themselves, these first two are not capable of uprooting the root, basic cause and source of our dissatisfaction and suffering. But the third one, the realization of emptiness or selflessness, is. And it's the only thing which can do that from the Buddhist point of view. So even though generating an understanding of impermanence, generating an understanding of the unsatisfactory nature of contaminated phenomena, generating positive qualities like love and compassion, all of these are extremely important and vital parts of the path. None of them, by themselves or even in concert with each other, are capable of totally removing the root cause of our suffering and dissatisfaction. Only the third one is capable of doing that, the realization of emptiness or selflessness. And for that reason, and perhaps some other reasons that I'm not aware of, it's called the Great Seal. And the Sanskrit for Great Seal is Mahamudra. Mahamudra. How many people have heard that term, Mahamudra? Yeah. So even if you haven't really studied it, it's kind of one of those terms that float around. Courses are often given called Mahamudra, or one of the readings is called Mahamudra. And basically, what it comes down to is understanding the ultimate nature, the empty nature of phenomena, particularly focused on the nature of our mind. Since the mind is productive of our suffering and of our happiness, understanding the mind's true nature, which comes down to understanding its empty nature, is of vital importance. So there's many traditions that are referred to as Mahamudra traditions of Mahamudra meditation. And they are all enabling us to get a clear understanding of the nature of our mind, both its conventional, relative nature and its ultimate nature, its emptiness. Okay? So Mahamudra meditation is a specific set of traditions dealing with the empty nature, specifically the empty nature of the mind. Okay. And then finally, the fourth seal of the Buddhist teachings is nirvana is peace. And what that indicates is nirvana is the state that we achieve having removed ignorance and the delusions from our mind. Then the resulting state that we experience is called nirvana, the state beyond suffering. And that is peace. And when we check up carefully, that's what we're looking for. We may call it by different names, like I've come into the habit of calling it calmness and peace and happiness and well-being and fulfillment. But all of that, if we had to summarize it in one word, is peace. Peace of mind, for example. We use that expression very often colloquially. You know, I'm looking for some peace of mind. And often that desire, that statement of that desire, looking for peace of mind, that's what we really want, comes when we're experiencing anything but peace of mind. In other words, we've surrounded ourselves with things which should make us happy, but we find that we're still in an agitated, uncomfortable state. And we might say to ourselves, well, I would give all my wealth, all my possessions, if I could just have a few moments of peace of mind. We hear ourselves and we hear other people say that all of the time, don't we? You know, that's not just Buddha telling us we should think that, but it comes up naturally. Oh, we just have to listen to it, and people say it all the time, don't they? You know? And don't we say it too, either in those words or in similar words? Okay? So the true peace that we're looking for isn't to be gained by more possessions, more this, more that. You know, it isn't to be gained by surrounding ourselves with more attractive sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tangible objects. It isn't by gaining knowledge, information, stockpiling, reputation, and the like. The only way that peace is to be gained is by achieving nirvana. But nirvana, contrary to what some people think, is not a state of extinction, of non-being, as some commentators incorrectly say. Nirvana is the state that we achieve when the root cause, ignorance, has been uprooted from our mind completely. And with that out, with that no longer functioning, the delusions dry up, and once the delusions have dried up, we no longer create contaminated karma, and therefore we no longer create the causes for suffering. And we achieve the state beyond suffering, which is nirvana. Okay? So, all of the Buddhist teachings are sealed in this fashion, with these four understandings. Okay? And if a teaching of Buddha, if a teaching doesn't have these seals on them, then it is not the authentic or final teaching of the Buddha. Okay? Those of you who have taken earlier modules in this series or other courses, when dealing with such subject matter as renunciation and precious human rebirth and so forth, realize that these themes keep reappearing again and again throughout the Buddhist teachings. In some cases, one seal is emphasized more than the other, but their combination together indicates the essential qualities of Buddhist teachings. All right? So, that third one, the Mahamudra, the Great Seal, that all phenomena are empty or selfless. Okay, now turning our attention specifically back to that. What understands emptiness, what gains that, the quality of mind that has that realization, is what's called wisdom. So that's why this course is called The Wisdom of Emptiness, because that state of mind which sees things as they are, in other words, as empty, as selfless, that state of mind is wisdom. And what it opposes, what it uproots, is ignorance. Okay? And as we did discuss either 1 or 2 weeks ago, I don't quite remember, ignorance here isn't simply a misunderstanding. I'm sorry, I take that back. Isn't simply not knowing something. That's more accurate. It's not simply not knowing something. That's the way that ignorance can be used. We can use that term. But that's not how it's being used here. How is it being used here? What does ignorance indicate here? The ignorance which is uprooted by the wisdom of emptiness. What does it indicate? Anyone?
To the wrong view.
Willfully clinging to the wrong view? Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. All right. I might question willfully, but certainly clinging to a mistaken view. In other words, it's not simply not knowing about something, it's misknowing something, having a misconception, having a mistaken attitude. And we've already discussed 2 other related mistaken attitudes, haven't we? Seeing seeing impermanent phenomena, viewing them as if they were permanent, that's a misconception, right? Seeing things which actually only make us more miserable as being able to provide us with ultimate happiness, that's a misconception, isn't it? Right? But the ultimate, the deepest, the worst misconception, the root of every other misconception, is the misconception that sees things that are empty as if they were not empty. So now we have to get closer to the idea of what is emptiness. talking about. Okay? So, one of the easiest, one of the most helpful ways of approaching this is to check in on the wrong view. Right? This is a very common approach in Buddhism. For instance, it isn't enough to tell a person phenomena are, to use another example, a different example, it isn't enough to remind people or to remind ourselves phenomena are impermanent. Because we can gain that understanding. Oh yes, I realize everything's made out of molecules, they're in constant motion, motion implies change, and therefore everything that's made out of molecules is impermanent. Yeah, I understand that. Right? That does no good. That's not helpful. What is helpful is to point out to others, if we're, a great teacher like the Buddha, or to ourselves, if we're trying to put those teachings into practice in our own life, is to point out where the mistaken concept of permanence arises. What's that like? To what extent are we under the influence of that misconception? When we get a clear image of that, then we can say, all right, that's the way I intuitively, habitually react to things, as if they were permanent, but they're impermanent. Now, when we bring up impermanence, it's fighting against something. It has a target. And the target isn't some just vague, mistaken idea that somebody might have. It's my own mistaken idea of the nature of things. Is that clear, that distinction? Right? So, in other words, the main aim is to investigate what's going on in my mind. How do I habitually look at things? And then apply the antidote to that. Not to just some general vague misconception, but my misconception. The misconceptions that are going on in my mind. The misconceptions of permanence, the misconception of what is the nature of happiness and what can give happiness. And here, ultimately, how do things exist? That's what this third one is talking about. What is the nature? What's the nature of the existence of things? How do things truly exist? Okay? So, if we take the approach that I just mentioned, what we have to discover is, how do we think things exist? What is the way that we view them now? And we start by how they appear to us. Okay? That's where we start. How do the phenomena that make up our universe, how do they appear to exist? We don't have to ask initially how they do exist, or even how I believe them to exist, but just simply, how do they appear to exist? And the answer to that is that all the things that make up our universe appear to exist to us, to our mind, as if they were self-existent. Minnie, I'm going to ask you to flip it over because I have a series of synonyms that are good to look at, and I'm not sure which one it is. It's one of them.
So flip it back to
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good. That's the one. Thank you. Okay. So, of all of the phenomena that we can investigate, the most important one to investigate is this sense of self, I. And I don't think I have to explain too much why. I mean, we've all had, even from the little exercise we've done before, we realize that this sense of I is always with us, and how we relate to it determines the nature of our existence, doesn't it? Whether I am happy or I am sad. It's all clustering around this sense of self. So what ultimately we have to understand is the nature of the I, our personal identity. We can apply the wisdom of emptiness analysis to any phenomenon. We can apply it to a cup, a flower, anything. And then sometimes, in fact, it is helpful to apply it to some external physical object, just to get used to the application of the logic and the approach. But if it just stays on that level, it's not going to make that much difference. But once we start applying it to our sense of self, that's where real spiritual transformation takes place. So ultimately what we have to investigate is the nature of the I. Okay? So how does the I ordinarily appear to us? Okay? How does the I, or the sense of self, or me, how does it appear to us? Okay? Just to be perverse, I'm going to start with number 7 and go up. Okay? The I appears to be inherently existent. Okay? In other words, there's the appearance and then the belief, and we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between appearance and belief later. There's the appearance of and belief in an inherently existent I. Another way of saying that is the appearance and belief in a truly existent I. In an independent I. And when we start investigating again the relationship between our sense of self and the aggregates, this body and mind aggregation, as we did, as we started to do the previous week, this sense of an independent I, the importance of gaining an understanding of this apparently independent I will become much more obvious. Okay? So an independent I. The next one, we're dealing with the false appearance and the mistaken belief in the I that exists from its own side. The I that exists from its own side. Next, the appearance or the belief in the self-existent I. But I think I mentioned that one all, didn't I think when I first started? Okay? All of these, in this context that we're discussing them, all of these should be understood as synonyms. They're all different ways of expressing the same mistaken concept. When we start studying Buddhist philosophy, it's called tenets of Buddhist philosophy. When we start studying that in great detail, we'll find that different Buddhist schools of philosophy can make distinctions between some of these. Okay? But according to the highest school, they're all coming down to the same point. So that's why in this context, we're using all of these as synonyms. But I just wanted to point out that, you know, when our study gets more accurate and we start studying different schools of philosophy, some of these may be defined a little bit differently. Right? But ultimately, they come down to the same point, which is why here we're referring to all of these as synonyms. And I'm giving them as synonyms because it's really helpful, to my mind at least, to be able to approach this difficult topic from as many different but related points of view as possible. For instance, we could be, in our speaking and our reading and so forth, using simply the term the inherently existing I, number 7. We could use that. You know, the mistaken concept to be overcome by the wisdom of emptiness is the mistaken appearance and belief in the inherently existing I. We could say that. And some teachings do say that. But for my mind, after about the 7th or 8th or 9th repetition of this, that phrase loses its flavor completely. Right? So being able to kind of change it or approach it from slightly different but yet synonymous points of view, I find helpful. So that's why I'm kind of offering these. There's even a few other synonyms which I haven't included here. But these are, in my experience, some of the most commonly used. All right? Now, all of these, the appearance of such an I, the belief in such an I, all of these are not only synonymous, but mistaken. Okay? They're mistaken. In other words, the inherently existing I doesn't exist. Right? The self-existent I doesn't exist. There's no such thing as an I that exists from its own side, an independent I, a truly existent I, an inherently existent I. These are all non-things. Right? These have the same level of reality, and here I'll use some very traditional examples. We could think of other ones. And I apologize if any of them are offensive, but they have the weight of tradition behind them. These things, the so-called inherently existent I, self-existent I, independent I, and so forth, they have the same level of reality as the son of a barren woman, as the horns on a rabbit's head, as a sky flower, a flower whose roots and blossoms grow in the sky. That's their level of reality, meaning they're completely unreal. You can talk about it. You can make a phrase, I was walking down the street and I met the son of a barren woman. You can construct a sentence like that, but there's nothing in reality that corresponds to that, is there? How could there be? Right? And, unless you make a composite photo and take the horns of a buffalo and superimpose it onto a rabbit, then there's no horns growing on a rabbit's head. And if you found one, if you found horns growing, then you just come up with a different example. Throw that one out, okay? All of these are examples of things which don't exist. But the fact that something doesn't exist doesn't mean that we can't believe it exists. Right? That's a crucial point. That's a crucial point. And we'll get into that a little bit. I'm not sure whether before we end today or not, but that's going to be something that we're really going to spend a lot of time investigating. Okay? So, all of these are mistaken conceptions. Or if we want to be really accurate, they're the objects of a mistaken conception. And in other words, I have a belief that my I exists independently. Or I have a belief that my I exists inherently. Or I have a belief that my I exists from its own side. So that belief, that attitude, that's the conception. The object of that conception is the self-existent I, the independent I, the inherently existent I, right? In other words, you have a mind and its object. You have a conception and the object of that conception, okay? So the object of these conceptions are false, meaning they don't exist at all. They have no reality. But that doesn't stop the misconception from arising. Right? In other words, you can have a belief, which is like a conception, in an object which has no existence. All right? So the object has no existence, but the conception has an existence, doesn't it? In other words, the thought has an existence. If I have a mistaken thought, the object of that thought is wrong, is non-existent, but the thought itself exists because I had it, right? It's impelling me to think this way or that way or act this way or that way. So it has existence, but its object is non-existent. That's maybe a subtle difference, but it's a very important one. Is that confusing, or do I have to go over that one again? Is it clear? Yeah? The difference between having a thought about something, that the something you have a thought about might be non-existent, but still you can have a thought. The thought can be existent. But it's a mistaken thought. Why? Because its object is non-existent. Okay? All right. This is a very important distinction to keep in mind, especially as these teachings unfold more and more. All right. So, that object the object of this misconception, the so-called inherently existing I, or self-existent I, or independent I, or I existing from its own side, however we want to call it, that object itself is sometimes referred to as the object to be refuted, or in the words that appear again and again in some of the printed matter that you've received, the refuting object. Okay? So why is it called that? Why is it called the object to be refuted? Right? It's because ignorance is holding on to the existence of something. It's believing in something. So how do you get free of that ignorance? By understanding that the object itself is non-existent. It never did exist, it doesn't exist now, it never will exist. So what you have to refute is the object. In other words, you have to figure out a way of understanding the non-existence of that object. Because if you understand the non-existence of that object, the mind that believes in it will naturally fade. Okay? Okay? If you see the object as non-existent, the mind that believes in it will lose its grasp. Will fade. Yes, I think a question?
Once you've achieved that, is it, I don't know what your word to use, dangerous for lack of any other,
Sure.
Once you're aware that that is a fantasy,
Yes.
is it dangerous then to think about it as a fantasy? Is it contrary to enlightenment to think about it as a fantasy?
To think about
as an illusion, whatever the approach.
No, the aim is to see it as an illusion. Instead of being dangerous, it's actually the pathway. And the result. But we'll get into that more. Okay. So, here, maybe I'll use this example, and maybe this is a convenient place to end for this evening. In this, I'm sorry, my memory for these things is not so good. In this time that we've spent together, have I used the example of the mirage in the desert? I have? Okay. Yeah. In this class? No? How about the example of the coiled rope and the snake? Yeah? Okay. Because these are two very, very common analogies to how we proceed here at this point, and how we're dealing with our increased understanding of the way things exist by refuting what doesn't exist. Okay, so let's return to the mirage example. Okay, so many people here have heard it already. Now you're hearing it again. Okay, but it's a very powerful example. Just to set up the situation once again, we're walking through an area, like a desert type of area, and in the distance we see what appears to be a lake. And since we're thirsty, we run towards it. When we get there, we discover that there's no there to get to. In other words, as we approach it, it fades. And it occurs to us that what appeared to be a lake was actually a mirage. It was an optical illusion caused by the sun being at a certain angle, the sand being a certain temperature, and ourselves being at a certain viewing point. Okay? So we give up the idea that there is a body of water there. And we go back to where we were and continue on our way. But before we continue on, we glance back in that same direction, and lo and behold, there's the lake again. Okay? The lake is appearing, this apparent lake is appearing because the conditions are similar to the way they were before. the angle of the sun, the heat of the sand, our own viewing position, and therefore this mirage, like the shimmering mirage, appears again as a result. And again, it looks like water. So it appeared as water before, and we believed it to be water, and now it's appearing as water again, but we no longer believe it's water. Okay? This is a very crucial distinction, because as long as the conditions are the same, the appearances will reassert themselves. But in the initial run-through, we thought it was water. The second time, we no longer think it's water. Why? Because we've investigated, and we found no water there. So now, when the appearance comes, it still reasserts itself. We still might say, how about that? It really does look like a lake over there. But it's not together with the belief in the existence. So we've refuted the object. We've refuted the water. And by refuting the water, we haven't let go of the appearance. The appearance is still arising. Okay? But by refuting the existence of the object, we've let go of the conception, the belief in the existence of the water. Okay? And this has an effect on our behavior. For instance, because we were thirsty before, when we ran to it with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety and, excitement and, this kind of emotionally upset state. Now when it appears again, those emotions don't arise because we've refuted the existence of water in that mirage. Okay? So even though it's appearing, it doesn't cause that same roller coaster emotion, of anticipation, excitement, and so forth. The example of the snake and the rope is a very similar example, but here the emotion that's overcome is one of fear. Right? So here, again, to set up the situation, we're in a dark area. It might be in a room, it might be outside somewhere. And we glance down and there's a snake. And we jump back in fright. We don't want to become bit. But then, when we're at a safe distance, we shine our flashlight and we notice the only thing that we see over there is a striped rope that happens to be coiled. And the conception comes, well, that's what I mistook for being a snake. We might double check. If we're frightened enough, we might say, well, yeah, okay, that wasn't the snake, but maybe there is a snake around here somewhere, And so we check around, we find there was no snake. Okay? So then we go back, kind of continue on our way. Now, the next time we pass that way, we look, and it appears to be a snake again, and we might even jump back the second time, right? Because the fear is so strong. But then we remind ourselves, and we double check with the flashlight, oh no, it isn't a snake, it's just a rope. So by doing this sufficient number of times, we definitely refute the existence of the snake. I'm not meaning by this that there's no such things as snakes, but there's no such thing as a snake there at that point. There's only a coiled rope. Okay? So, when that happens, we may continue to have the appearance of a snake because it looks so similar. But we no longer believe it to be a snake, right? So the appearance without belief, appearance without this conception that it is a snake. And because of that, fear no longer arises. Certainly not the real strong fear that appeared the first time. Some fears, we've built up such a habit for that even when we know it's not a snake, because even that it's similar, it kind of feeds into it, right? But that overriding fear, I've got to get away because it's going to bite me, that's not there anymore. Why? Because we've refuted the existence of that object. We've refuted, by repeated investigation, the existence of the snake over there. So there's no water in the mirage. There's no snake on the rope. Those are the objects to be refuted, or, as it's sometimes phrased, the refuting object. So similarly, now getting to the crux of the matter, we hold on to, let me start again, I'm sorry. What appears to us is as if our I, our sense of self, were somehow or other independent, concrete. There's another synonym, right? Self-existent, independent. Our I seems to exist from its own side, meaning that it doesn't seem to arise simply as a way of designating something going on in our body and mind. Like I'm sitting, I'm meditating, a bodily action, a physical action, which we simply apply I to. The I doesn't seem to appear that way, and this we'll discuss a lot more next time. Instead, our sense of I seems to have its own self-existence. Doesn't seem to depend on anything else. Doesn't seem to depend on the body for its existence or the mind for existence. There's a truly existent, self-existent, inherently existent, existing from its own side I, somewhere here, right? And by holding on to it, in other words, not only having it appear to our mind, but believing in its existence. In fact, more than just believing in it, having it to be the center of our existence is what is productive of all of the delusions, whether it be fear, greed, attachment, jealousy, pride, whatever. They all comes from holding on to the existence of such an apparently independently existing I, or self. So that is the root cause of all the suffering, believing in that. Believing in water in a mirage or a snake in a rope will make us maybe uncomfortable or restless, but it's not the root cause of all suffering, is it? But holding on to this misconception about the very nature of the I, of the self, is the root cause of all suffering, without exception. So, the aim of the investigation is to feel, all right, if it is so real, if it is controlling my life, if I believe in it so strongly, then where is it? Shining the flashlight of wisdom onto this I. If it exists, it should be clear. If it doesn't exist, it should be unfindable. Okay? And that's where the investigation is taking us. Okay? So the homework, again, is a kind of a repeat of what I gave before, right? Sneaking up on yourself and noticing, oh, I is arising. But when that happens, take it just a little step further and thinking on where is this I? You know, not only is it arising, not only is it appearing, but can I find it somewhere? And the hint is to look for it in some event that's happening either in this body complex or in this mind complex, or in both. Or, if you want to use Buddhist terminology, somewhere in the 5 aggregates. Remember, the 1 aggregate being body, the other 4 being various attributes of mind or consciousness. Okay? And if it's difficult to do that while it's happening, while it's arising, then try to remember it, and then later that day, when you're in kind of calm, safe environment, recreate that experience and then do the investigation. Because it's admittedly hard to do the investigation at the moment it's arising. But just note its arisal. And especially a note how this sense of I arises, how it arises in times of emotional turmoil. In other words, when you're feeling really scared, right? Really anxious, really elated, you know, when you're over the moon or when you're under the ocean, right? In other words, at those critical moments. Because as Lama Zopa points out in one of his teachings, a person who has meditated well on emptiness can spot this object to be refuted at any time, whether we're in an emotionally calm state or an emotionally agitated state. But for those of us who are not familiar with this meditation, then it's in the emotionally agitated state where we have a chance to glimpse the object of our misconceptions. Okay? So there's certain times when everything's kind of going all right, you're neither over the moon crazy with elation or are you really scared or depressed. At those times you might say I, like I'm lifting up this cup. Kind of very emotionally bland statement. Well, if our meditation on emptiness were very acute and very experienced, we would see within that experience what is to be refuted and what is not to be refuted. We'd be able to separate that out. But, for us who are not experienced, it doesn't arise. But in moments of great fear, great anger, great elation, it does appear. And that's the time to take a look at it. Because at that moment there is the appearance of the self-existent I, the independent I. So that's something we can investigate. Okay? All right. Yeah. That's all. And I'll see all you non-existent people next week. Oh, one thing. We started with the motivation, then we tried to concentrate. So what's left? Dedication. But I think by now we know how to do our own dedication. But as a reminder, if there's any value created by our investigations here today, then may it be understood that there's no sphere of this activity that has even an atom of concrete self-existence. And with that understanding, may all beings be removed from their mental and physical sufferings. May all teachers, such as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, have long and fruitful lifetimes. May we come under their benevolent care in this and in all future states of existence. May the Buddhas continue to turn the peerless wheel of the Dharma, and may we ourselves achieve full spiritual awakening as swiftly as possible in order to repay the infinite kindness we've received from each and every being.